Welcome back to Park Ranger Narrative. Tonight's story begins at a ranger station so remote, even the radio signal didn't always make it out. For 30 years, I read one mountain range for a living. Not as a tourist, as the man with the map board and the radio. The one who kept people alive by reading terrain the way others read faces. 40 miles of trail, every route, every spring, every blowdown. I knew it. So when I tell you what's coming, know what kind of witness I am. I don't scare easy. I don't lose my place. I built my whole life on one belief, that the woods obey rules. 13 times, those rules broke in front of me. I'm not going to ask you to believe me. I stopped needing that years ago. I only ask that you listen the way I'd have listened back when I still thought I had the woods figured out. Find somewhere quiet and maybe leave a light on. The mile that wasn't there. I have walked the same 40 miles of trail 400 times. I know every route that lifts in spring, every blowdown that takes 2 seasons to clear. So when I tell you there was a mile that did not belong to that trail, a mile I walked through and could not find again the next morning, understand that I'm not a man who loses his place. I lose nothing. That's the whole problem with this story. I came up through the trail crew, not the romance of it. You learn a corridor the way a surgeon learns a body, by repetition, by touch, by the small wrongnesses that tell you something has changed. By my 15th year, I could close my eyes on a section of Southern Virginia ridgeline and recite the order of the switchbacks. The lean of one particular hemlock, the exact place the spring crossed under the treadway and turned the soil black. That October, I was hiking it for myself, not for work. Off-season. The leaf fall was heavy enough that the trail became a yellow tunnel, and I was counting blazes more from habit than need. The white rectangles are painted at sightline intervals. You should always see the next one before you lose the last. It's a design redundancy. You are never meant to be lost on the AT. That's the point of it. Somewhere past the second gap or the blazes stopped. Not all at once. I walked maybe a quarter mile telling myself the next one was around the bend, the way you do, then half a mile. The treadway underfoot was still unmistakably a trail packed, slightly cupped from a century of boots, edged with the low berm that forms where feet never fall. A trail doesn't happen by accident. Something had walked this into the ground over decades. But there were no blazes, and there was no record of my own passing in the soft sections. And here's why that mattered. I'd been the only person out there for hours. My print should have been the only story the mud told. Instead, the mud told nothing. Smooth. Rained on smooth, except it hadn't rained. Let me be exact, because exactness is all I've got. The light didn't change. The temperature didn't drop in the cinematic way people expect. What changed was the sound. The southern forest is never truly silent. There's always the high static of insects, the settle of leaves, a creek somewhere below. Out there, the sound didn't stop so much as flatten, like someone had drained the depth out of it. I stood in an anechoic room once, in a lab, for a demonstration. It was that. A forest with the echo removed. I did the discipline thing. I stopped, took a bearing, checked my map against the contour lines I could see. The terrain matched. The ridge sat where it should. The drainage sat where it should. By every measure, I was exactly where I belonged, except the trail under my boots appeared on none of the maps I carried, and I carried all of them. I went forward because turning back felt worse. After what I'd guess was 11 minutes, the blazes returned. White, faded just right, spaced just right. The sound came back with them. I actually flinched at the volume of one ordinary bird. I was on the AT again. I knew the rock I was looking at. Next morning in daylight, I walked back to find that unmarked mile. I found the gap. I found the rock. Between them ran one continuous, properly blazed trail. No branch, no fork, no faint herd path peeling off into the laurel. There was nowhere for that mile to have been. There still isn't. I've looked every year since. The trail keeps its own counsel, and it has never once shown me where I went. What the dog wouldn't pass, a working search dog, does not lie. It can't be talked into a story or out of one. It follows what its nose tells it, and on the worst day of my career, a dog I'd have trusted with my own life sat down in the middle of a clear trail and refused, politely, miserably, completely, to take one more step north. There was nothing there. I have never been more frightened by nothing in my life. I spent 11 years adjacent to search and rescue, not the dog handler, the coordinator, the one with the map board and the radio. So I know what the dogs do, and I know the people who run them. The woman running Bell that day was the steadiest handler in 3 counties. Bell was a German Shepherd, 6 years old, certified in air scent and trailing, with more live finds than most teams see in a decade. We were looking for a day hiker, a man in his 50s who'd left the Gap parking area and not come back. Routine almost. Clear trail, fine weather. We figured we'd find him with a rolled ankle inside 2 miles. Bell took the scent off his car seat and went to work, nose down, tail swinging in the steady metronome that means I have it, I'm following it. A 1.5 mile textbook. Then she stopped. She didn't lose the scent. A dog that loses a scent casts circles, works the air, tries to recover the thread. Belle did none of that. She stood square in the trail, facing forward, and her whole body changed. Tail down, ears back. She lowered her front end toward the ground, but it wasn't a play bow and it wasn't a point. The handler told me later it was the posture Belle had used exactly once before near a body. But there was no body. The trail ahead lay open and ordinary, dappled with afternoon light, climbing gently toward a stand of oak. The handler tried to send her on. Belle wouldn't go. She'd walk the handler's leg up to a precise line on the ground. You could almost have chalked it across the treadway. And at that line, she'd stop and lean back. Not bolt, not bark. Just decline. Eyes fixed on something at about the height of a standing man, tracking it slowly left to right, as if it were moving and they were not. I'll be careful here, because I've heard the explanations, and most are good. Dogs spook. Bee nests bear scent, a predator's marking, an updraft carrying something foul from the drainage below. We checked. No carcass, no nest, no fresh sign. And by Belle's own behavior, the scent of our missing man ran right up to that line and kept going. She clearly wanted to follow, and her body would not let her. We found the man 2 days later, alive, 3 drainages over, with no memory of how he'd gotten there, and a story he wouldn't repeat the same way twice. That's a separate file. What stays with me is Belle. A second team came through an hour later with a fresh dog. Same response. Different animal, never met the first, sat down at the same place, faced the same direction. The handlers marked it on the map with a pencil dot and a question mark. That dot is still on the master overlay in a county building, because nobody's ever had the nerve to erase it. I walked the line myself, on foot by daylight, deliberately, because I needed to prove I could. I felt nothing, no cold, no pressure, no story. I'm not the instrument a dog is. whatever stood in that trail and turned two trained animals into trembling cowards, didn't bother introducing itself to a man with a clipboard. But the dogs knew. That's the part I can't set down. The dogs always know first, and they're never wrong. And on that trail, they both looked at the empty air and said the same thing. No. The photographs that aged. I have a roll of film in an evidence sleeve I'm not supposed to still own. 36 exposures, shot on one overcast afternoon at a shelter that no longer stands. 35 are ordinary. The 36th shows a person who wasn't there, and frame by frame, that person gets older. This is the one I don't tell at parties. Before everyone carried a phone, hikers carried cameras. When one of them went missing, his pack came back to us full of gear. Standard procedure, we catalog everything in case it tells us where he went. His camera still had film inside. We developed it the way you'd read a journal, looking for the last thing he saw. The first 33 frames were a hike. Trailhead sign. His boots. A view from a bald. A self-portrait at arm's length, grinning, sunburned. The 34th showed the inside of a 3-sided shelter, bare plank floor. Log register on a nail. The dark mouth of the sleeping platform behind. An ordinary record of an ordinary night. He'd photographed the register, probably to remember the names of people he'd met. In the 35th frame, there was a figure on the platform. It sat at the very back, in the dark. The lab tech first took it for a sleeping hiker, a lump in a bag. But the contrast was wrong. The figure was lit, faintly, as if by a different light than the rest of the frame, and it sat upright, hands on its knees, facing the camera. A gaunt man in clothing that didn't read as modern, no nylon, no logos, just dark cloth that swallowed the flash instead of bouncing it back. The 36th frame held the same composition, same shelter, same angle, taken by the camera's own mechanism maybe 2 seconds later. The figure was still there, but it had aged. The same face, unmistakably, except the cheeks had hollowed. The hair had gone from dark to white. The hands on the knees had become the knotted hands of a very old man. 2 frames, 2 seconds. 60 years across a single face. I've heard every irrational account and offered most of them myself. Double exposure, the likeliest culprit, 2 images on 1 negative. Except the rest of the frame stays pin-sharp and singular. Only the figure changes. Light leak, chemical artifact, an emulsion flaw. The lab ruled them out one by one. And the lab had no reason to lie, because the lab was as shaken as I was. What I keep circling back to is the register. He'd photographed the shelter log in frame 34, and we recovered that physical log. His is the last entry. Below his name, in a different handshakey, the way the very old write is one final line. Thank you for the company. No name, no date. The ink is old, genuinely old, the lab confirmed. Older than the paper it sits on. I know that sentence is impossible. I'm telling it to you anyway. We never found the man. The shelter burned in a lightning fire 2 seasons later and was never rebuilt. There's a flat spot now and a chimney of stacked stone. And if you didn't know, you'd walk right past it. I went back once with the contact sheet in my pocket, some idea of matching the angle, standing where he'd stood. I couldn't do it. I reached the flat spot and could not make myself raise a camera toward the place where the platform had been. Something in me, older than reason, refused the same flat no the dogs gave on that other trail. So I left the film where it is. I check it sometimes. The old man hasn't aged any further. He doesn't need to. He's already as old as he's going to get. And he is still, faintly, smiling. The weather that came from inside the hollow. Weather on the ridges does what physics tells it to. Cold air sinks, warm air climbs. Storms announce themselves on the barometer hours before they arrive. I trust weather the way I trust gravity. So understand exactly how wrong it was, one June evening, to watch a wall of cold come up out of a hollow against every rule the atmosphere obeys, and to hear, inside it, the sound of a crowd. Mountain weather is the first thing you learn to read, because it's the thing most likely to kill you. I carried a small analog barometer for 30 years and trusted it over any forecast. That evening it sat steady, high pressure, clear, a warm front of summer air resting easy on the ridge where I'd stopped to cook. The hollow below me, a deep V of old hardwood cove forest that's been growing since before this country had a name, was filling with the ordinary blue of dusk. The cold came out of it like water poured uphill. I felt it at my ankles first, a moving line of cold air sliding up the slope toward me. That's backwards. Cold air is dense. It pools, it sinks, it settles into hollows at night, which is exactly why you don't camp in them. It does not climb a ridge in a discreet advancing front on a windless evening. And there was no wind. The trees beside me stood dead still, but the cove forest, hundreds of feet below, was moving, the canopy heaving in a wind I could see and not feel, a wind sealed entirely inside the bowl of the hollow. And it carried sound, voices, not words. I'll be honest about the limit of it, but the unmistakable texture of many people talking at once, the way a crowd sounds through a wall, rising and falling, a hum with edges in it. The sound a town makes, drifting up out of a forest where the nearest town was 19 trail miles away, and the nearest road a fire road no vehicle had touched in a decade. I checked the barometer. Steady. Whatever was happening down there wasn't weather, because weather moves the needle, and the needle never twitches. Here's the rational frame I built that night to keep my hands still. Cold air drainage can reverse under specific thermal conditions. Cove forests grow their own microclimates. Sound travels strangely over water and through inversions, a far-off road, a campground, a church, folded up the drainage by a layer of cold air acting like a lens. All true, all possible. None of it explains a wind that lived in one bowl of forest and touched nothing around it, or cold that climbed, or what happened when I walked 30 feet along the ridge to the hollow's open mouth. The voices got clearer, and one of them, for just a moment, in the middle of the crowd hum, laughed. A single, distinct, human laugh. Close. I went back to my stove. I'm not ashamed of that. I cooked my meal and watched that cold front of voices sit in the hollow for the better part of an hour, the canopy thrashing in its private storm, and then, around full dark, it simply stopped. The trees went still, the cold ebbed back down the slope the way it had come. The barometer had never moved. The silence afterward was so complete that the return of ordinary insect noise hit me like a slammed door. I asked old-timers about that hollow afterward. Most just shrugged. One man, long retired, heard the whole thing out and told me the cove had a name in his grandfather's time, a name he wouldn't repeat, and that the rule had always been simple. You do not camp where you can hear the gathering. I asked him what the gathering. He said that was precisely the question you weren't supposed to ask. Then he changed the subject. And I let him. The cairn that built itself. A cairn is a human thing. Stacked stones, trail markers, built by hands above the tree line where blazes can't reach. I've built hundreds. I can read them like handwriting, which is why I knew the morning I found a new one standing where no human had reason to marking, that something had been stacking stone in the dark and that it had built the thing wrong, in a way I've never been able to unsee. Above a certain elevation, the trees give out and you mark the way with rock. Cairns. On the exposed balds and the high rocky ridges, they're a lifeline in fog. You walk cairn to cairn the way you walk blaze to blaze in the forest. I've maintained them for years. There's a craft to it. A good cairn is stable, broad-based, built to shed weather and survive a winter, and it stands where it's useful at a turn, at a sight line, where a hiker in whiteout needs reassurance. The one I found that morning was none of those things. I'd camped just below the tree line and come up onto the bald at first light. It stood in the open, maybe 200 feet off the trail, in a spot where a cairn served no purpose. No turn there, no view to confirm, nothing to mark. It was a place you'd never build, because building there would only confuse the next hiker, and confusing the next hiker is sin of trail marking. I went to it assuming someone had made an honest mistake I'd have to undo. Up close, the mistake got stranger. It was tall, taller than me, and I'm not a short man, well over 6 feet of stacked stone, which is a serious quantity of rock to move by hand. The stones ran large, far larger than a passing hiker stacks for fun. Some I couldn't have lifted alone, and I wasn't weak. And they were fitted, not balanced fitted. Flat faces matched to flat faces with a care, a full trail crew with mortar, and a long day might manage, and a wanderer never could. It had been built from the inside out, if that makes sense. The way it interlocked, you couldn't have assembled it from the outside. The core stones had to go in first, in sequence, which means whoever made it planned it the way you plan a wall. The ground around the base was its own answer. Bald summits up there, a thin soil, matted grass, lichen-crusted rock. Moving a ton of stone leaves, scars, drag marks, crushed plants, divots where rock was levered free. There were none. The grass at the base stood upright, unbruised, growing right against the bottom stones as though the tower had stood 100 years. But I knew that I was bald. I'd crossed it a week earlier. There had been nothing there. I'd have seen a 6-foot tower of rock from half a mile out. The rational frame and why it failed? A crew could have built it, except none was scheduled, none reported it, and no crew works without leaving a staging mess. Hikers could have built it as art, except the scale was beyond casual labor and the engineering beyond casual skill. It could have been older than I realized, something I'd simply never noticed, except I'd walked within 10 feet of that exact spot 8 days before, in clear weather, looking right at it. I photographed it. I left it standing. Taking it down felt in a way I can't defend, like a discourtesy, like erasing something's work. I reported it instead. A crew went up the next week to assess it since it wasn't sanctioned. It was gone. Not dismantled, gone. No scattered stones, no pile of removed rock, no scar in the grass. The bald lay exactly as it had before, as if the tower had never stood there at all. The crew chief, a friend of mine, called me a liar in the gentlest possible way, then looked at my photograph and admitted he couldn't explain the photograph either. We don't talk about it now. The grass remembers nothing. Neither, apparently, does the mountain. But I have the picture, and the picture remembers fine. 11 voices on the radio. Radio doesn't lie about distance. A handheld on a ridge reaches as far as the terrain allows and no farther line of sight. Hard physics, no romance to it. So when our repeater logged 11 transmissions in one night from a call sign dead for 30 years on a frequency no current radio used, I stopped believing the rules I'd built my safety on were the only rules running up there. I'll keep this one technical, because the technical part is what makes it impossible. Backcountry communication runs on line-of-sight radio, boosted by repeaters, mounted on high points that grab a weak signal and rebroadcast it across the ridges. As coordinator, I monitored a logged channel, every transmission time-stamped and recorded, an unbroken paper and tape trail. Because in search work, the log can become evidence. One clear winter night with no teams in the field and the whole system idling, the repeater began logging traffic. 11 transmissions spread across roughly 4 hours between about midnight and dawn. Each opened with a call sign, the old-style identifier the service had used decades earlier, retired before my time, a designation I only recognized from faded equipment in a storage room. The voice was a man's, calm, professional, using the clipped radio discipline of an era of operators who've mostly passed on. And he was reporting a search. Position reports, grid references, weather observations. The measured cadence of a man walking a sector and calling it in. Reached the saddle, no sign, moving to the next drainage. Heavy fog setting in, visibility down to 50 feet. Found a campsite, cold, no occupant marking location. Hour after hour, one searcher, working a grid alone in the dark, narrating a hunt for someone he never named. The grid references were real coordinates. I plotted them the next morning. They traced a search pattern, a competent, methodical, expanding sweep across a section of ridge that had, I confirmed in the old paper archives, been the site of a real search, decades ago, for a hiker who was never found. And the searcher of record on that case, the man whose call sign matched, had himself died in the field that winter, gone out alone against orders in worsening weather, never to come back. They recovered him in the spring. They never recovered the hiker he'd been looking for. The 11th transmission, logged just before dawn, was different. The calm broke only slightly, the way a steady man's voice breaks when he finally admits something to himself. He said, and I have this on tape. I can see him. He's just ahead. I'm going to bring him in. Then nothing. The repeater logged no further traffic. The frequency went back to its 30-year silence. I've spent a long time on the rational frame, and parts of it hold. Old recordings can bleed onto modern systems through equipment fault. Atmospheric conditions, tropospheric ducting, can carry a distant signal hundreds of miles and drop it into a repeater on a cold, clear night. A hoaxer with old gear and old documents could, with enormous effort, have staged it. Every one of those is likelier than the alternative. But ducting carries live signals across distance, not recordings across 30 years. There were no old recordings of that man. That the case predated routine taping. No surviving equipment used that frequency, and a hoaxer would have needed the dead man's exact voice, his exact call sign, the real archived grid coordinates of a search most people had forgotten, and a reason to broadcast it all to an empty channel where, statistically, no one was even listening. I was only listening because I couldn't sleep. I kept the tape. Against regulation, I kept it. Years later, I played it once for the retired man who'd known the searcher wanted to know if the voice was right. He listened to all 11 transmissions without a word. At the end, he lifted off the headphones, set them down with great care, and said, "That's him." That's exactly how he sounded when he was working. Then he asked me never to play it for him again. He said it wasn't a recording of a man who used to be alive. He said it was a recording of a man still out there searching on a night that for him had never ended. I didn't argue. I'm not sure he was wrong. The hiker who signed out twice. The trail registers are a chain of evidence written in 100 hands. People sign in, sign out, leave a date and a name and a destination. It's how we reconstruct a hiker's last known movements. One winter, I traced a missing man's path through the logs and found, in his own clear handwriting, that he'd signed out of a shelter 4 hours before he'd signed into it. Same man, same hand, wrong order. I have never been able to make time run the right way through that file. Most strange register stories are about strange messages. This one's about chronology, which is somehow worse, because chronology isn't supposed to be negotiable. A solo hiker went overdue in late autumn. A careful man experienced, the kind who logs everything. When he failed to check in, I did what I always do. Walked his paper trail backward through the shelter registers, shelter to shelter, building a timeline. Hikers note the date and often the time, and a good logbook lets you watch a person move down the corridor like a bead on a string. His string ran clean for 4 days. Then it knotted. At one shelter, call it the north one he signed in at by his own notation, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Noting clear weather and his plan to push on to the next shelter, the south one, in the morning. Ordinary. But at the south shelter, 8 trail miles further on, he had also signed in. His handwriting, unmistakable. Same pen, same little habit of underlining the date, except at the south shelter he'd written the time as noon same date. He had signed into a shelter 8 miles south at 12 o'clock and into the shelter 8 miles north at 4 o'clock on the same afternoon, walking in a direction that made the second impossible before the first. I reached for an error first. People misjudge time without a watch. People write the wrong date in the backcountry constantly. But he'd worn a watch. We recovered it later, and he was meticulous everywhere else. Times to the quarter hour, never a contradiction until this one. And it wasn't a small slip. It was 8 miles and 4 hours of impossibility. Sitting in 2 separate physical books I held in 2 separate hands. There was a third entry at the south shelter, below his impossible noon sign-in, in the same handwriting but markedly worse letters dragging, the way a man writes when his hand is shaking. Or cold or afraid was a second note. No time on this one. It read, "Something is wrong with the day. I keep arriving before I leave. I'm going to wait here until it stops." He didn't wait. The next shelter south held no entry from him. The trail of logs simply ended at the south shelter with that note, and a search of the corridor in both directions turned up nothing. No camp, no gear, no body, in either the direction he'd come from or the one he'd been heading. He was last physically confirmed by another hiker at the north shelter, the 4 o'clock one, the later one. As far as any living witness could establish, the last place he was seen alive was the place he had left first. Every rational frame breaks. He wrote the south entry on a different day and misdated it, but the ink, the page position, and the surrounding entries from other hikers place it firmly that afternoon. Someone forged it, but to forge his hand, his habits, his fear, in two books miles apart, to no conceivable purpose. He was confused, hypothermic, his sense of time unraveling, and honestly, that's the one I almost believe, because a cold and frightened mind does strange things. But hypothermia doesn't make you arrive somewhere before you leave the place you're heading. It makes you slow, not nonlinear. The two registers are still archived. I've laid them side by side more than once, his two entries facing each other across a table, noon and 4 o'clock, south and north. The later sign-in describes a man alive and well. The earlier one describes a man already coming apart. I keep arriving before I leave. I read that line, and the floor tilts a little every single time. Wherever he went, I don't believe he went forward. The child at the spring. There are no children alone in the deep backcountry. It's the one thing the math won't allow. A small child cannot get 15 miles from the nearest road by itself. So when I knelt at a spring to filter water, and a little boy spoke to me from the laurel, polite and calm and entirely alone, the wrongness arrived before the fear did. Children don't appear out there. And this one knew my name. Water is the fixed point of backcountry life. You plan your day around springs, the reliable ones, marked on the maps, sometimes the only water for miles. I was kneeling at one I'd used 100 times, a steady spring in a fold of mountain laurel, filtering into a bottle, when a voice behind me said, "You shouldn't drink that one." A child's voice. I turned. A boy stood in the laurel, maybe 7 or 8, in clothes that were clean and dry and faintly old-fashioned, buttoned and plain. The kind you don't hike in. No pack, no adulting, no sound of an adult. Just a small boy standing easy in the brush, watching me with the patient look children get when they know something you don't. My first thought was logistics, because that's how my mind is wired. We were a long way from anywhere. A child this small does not walk this far, no campsite near, no hiker I'd passed, no version of events I could build in which a boy this age stood alone this spring. The wrongness was mathematical before it was anything else. I asked where his parents were. He didn't answer that. He said again, gently, "You shouldn't drink that one, the other one's better. Past the big rock." And then he said my name. My first name, which was written on nothing I wore, in a tone like he'd known me a long while. Here's what I noticed, because noticing was the only thing keeping me steady. He threw no clear shadow, though the light was bright and broken through the canopy and everything else cast one. His clothes were dry in a wet, humid hollow where my own shirt had soaked through. And he didn't move the way a child moves. No fidgeting, no shifting weight, no curiosity about my gear, which is the first thing any real kid investigates. He just stood, balanced and still, watching me with an attention far too old for the face it sat in. I did not drink the water. I made that choice on pure instinct, and I've turned it over ever since. I capped the bottle, said something polite and meaningless, and stood slowly, the way you rise near something you don't want to startle. He watched me do it. When I'd backed up to the trail, he said one last thing. "It's faster if you don't look back." And he smiled a kind smile, and that was the worst part of all of it. I walked. I didn't look back. I went to the second spring, past the big rock, exactly where he'd said, and it was there, a spring I'd never known about, on no map, clean and cold and good. I filtered there. I drank that water, and I was fine. Here's what's kept me up since. Weeks later I heard, secondhand, that the first spring the one he warned me off had been tested for an unrelated reason and found fouled, something dead in the source upstream. Drinking from it would have left me badly, dangerously sick, miles from help alone. The boy was right. The boy saved me. And I can't decide whether that makes the whole thing better or so much worse, because if he was real enough to be right, then he was real, and a real child cannot have been standing alone at that spring, and a real child does not know your name, or cast no shadow, or tell you it's faster if you don't look back. I never have. Looking back, I mean. Not once. And I don't intend to start now. The markers that counted past 0 trail mileage counts in one direction. The markers add up as you walk, a comforting arithmetic that tells you how far you've come and how far you've left. One foggy day, mine started counting down past 0, into negative numbers no sign on any trail has ever shown, and at the bottom of the count stood a sign that shouldn't exist, naming a distance to a place I've spent years trying to forget the name of. This one is small and quiet, and it's never let go of me. On a stretch in deep fog, the kind where the white closes to 30 feet, and the world shrinks to the next few yards of trail I was navigating by the small distance markers some sections carry, little posts, the mileage to the next landmark. In fog, they're a comfort. Each one says you're still on the line and ticks the distance down. The first few read normal. Then the numbers turned strange. A sign said the next shelter was 3 miles. I walked a solid mile pace and watched both honestly, and the next sign said 3 miles. I walked again. Real distance, real time, and the next said 4. The distance was growing as I walked toward it. I told myself I was misreading warned signs in bad light, and I kept on because in fog the only sane choice is to follow the trail you're standing on. The numbers climbed for a while. 5 miles. 7. Then they began to fall, not back down toward the shelter, but past it, past 0, into a count I didn't understand. 1 mile to the shelter. The next, properly spaced, said 0. I stopped there and searched the fog for the shelter that should have been at my feet. And there was nothing, just trail, just white, just the next post, waiting at the edge of sight. I went to it. What else do you do? It read negative. The next, -2. The numbers were counting down below 0 into a distance that doesn't exist. And each sign was real wood and real paint, weathered, old, set into the ground like it had stood for years. I need you to understand. I touched them. I ran my thumb across the carved numbers. They were not something I could rub away. I should have turned back. I half knew it then, but fog flattens your judgment along with the world. And there's a terrible logic to following a line of signs, even after the signs go insane, because they're the only structure left in the white. So I kept walking down the count. -3, -5, -8. At -11 there was a different sign. Bigger, older than all the rest, the wood gone, silver gray, the lettering carved deep and filled with something dark. It gave a distance of a small number, close to a named place. I won't say the name. I found it on no map. I've asked people who've spent their whole lives in those mountains and watched 2 of them go quiet and 1 of them get up and leave the room. The sign pointed off the trail, into the laurel, down a faint path the fog was very gently lifting to reveal as if it wanted me to see the way. I stopped. I stood at that last sign for a long time. And then the fog, which had been my entire world for an hour, simply thinned, burned back in a few minutes, the way mountain fog does, and the strange signs were gone. All of them. The trail behind me carried its normal markers in their normal places, counting up the way they always had. The shelter sat a quarter-mile ahead, exactly where the map promised. I went inside and shook for an hour. I never found the place named. I've never tried very hard, and I've never tried at all in fog, because the thing about a countdown is that it's going somewhere. It reaches the bottom, and I have always been grateful that the fog lifted before I learned what waits at -12. The hand on my shoulder. This is the one with witnesses and a camera and a moment 3 of us saw at once. We took a group photo on a summit, 4 of us, arms around each other, grinning at a self-timer on a rock. When the photo came back, there were 5 people in it. The 5th stood at the end of the row with his hand on my shoulder. I felt that hand. I had turned, and there had been no one there. I trust this story more than most of mine, because I wasn't alone. 4 of us went up to a summit. One clear afternoon, me and 3 friends, all experienced, all sober, the kind of people who'd laugh at a ghost story rather than tell one. We wanted a group shot. We balanced a camera on a rock, set the self-timer, ran back, and crowded into a row at the edge of the view, arms across each other's shoulders, the way you do. In a few seconds, while the timer counted down, a hand came to rest on my right shoulder. I assumed it was the friend on that side, shifting position. The weight was distinct, a real hand. Warm. The faint press of fingers. The shutter clicked. We broke apart laughing, and I turned right to say something to whoever had grabbed me, and the friend on my right was a full arm's length away, both hands in his pockets, mid-sentence, with someone else. No one stood where the hand had been. Nothing there but the drop-off and the air and the long blue view. I didn't say anything. You don't at the moment. You file it as a muscle twitch, a strap settling, a trick of the body, and you move on. I'd half forgotten it by the time the photo came back weeks later. There were 5 of us in the frame, 4 of us grinning where we should be, and at the right end of the row, beyond my friend with his hands in his pockets, slightly behind us, the 5th figure, a man, tall in muted clothes that matched no one's bright hiking gear. His face was turned slightly down and away, blurred just enough that I've never been able to fix his features, though I've stared at that photo more than almost anything I own. And his arm reached across the gap, his hand resting on my right shoulder, exactly where I'd felt it, exactly the weight. All 4 of us are in the photo, so there was no one left to be standing there. We'd counted ourselves a dozen times by then. 4 people went up that mountain. 4 came down. 4 are accounted for in the frame plus 1. The self-timer photographed something that stood in our row, touched me, and left no one behind when the shutter closed. The rational frames are thin, and I'll give them anyway. A stranger wandered into frame, except the summit was empty, ours alone, and a stranger doesn't lay a hand on you for a stranger's photo. Double exposure, except it was 1 frame, 1 click, and the figure interacts with us, casts the right shadow, stands in the right light. A lens artifact. Except artifacts that don't have arms that reach across a measured gap to land exactly where a living man felt a hand he couldn't explain. We don't talk about it much, the 4 of us, but we've never once disagreed about what happened. That's the thing that anchors it. 4 independent memories, 1 photograph, 1 felt hand, no 5th person. We weren't a credulous group. We became quieter one. I still have the photo. The man at the end hasn't moved, hasn't sharpened, hasn't faded. His hand is still on my shoulder across all these years. And every so often on a quiet trail, a warmth will settle on that exact spot, the right shoulder a pressure with the shape of fingers. I've learned not to turn around, not out of fear anymore, but because I already know what I'd see, which is no one. And I already know what the photograph would say later, which is that he was there the whole time. The shelter that wasn't on the list. Every shelter on the trail is documented, built, numbered, mapped, maintained, listed in the guides hikers carry in their pockets. There's no such thing as an unknown shelter. So the night I took refuge from a storm in a sturdy, well-kept shelter that appears on no map and in no record, and that was warm inside, recently swept, and waiting I slept in a building that officially does not exist, and I was not its only occupant. I got caught out by a fast storm, the kind that builds behind a ridge and is on top of you before you can react. By my map, I was between shelters, a long way from the next one, when I came around a bend in the failing light and the driving rain, and found a shelter exactly where I needed one, and exactly where my guide swore there was none. A classic three-sided structure, but old. Hand-hewn timber, dark with age. The craftsmanship heavier and finer than the standardized shelters built in my lifetime. In perfect repair. The roof sound, the floor swept, and when I ducked in out of the rain, it was warm. Noticeably warmer than the air outside, the way a room is warm when someone's just been in it. No fire, no stove, no source for the heat, and a register on a nail, the way there always is. I told myself I'd misjudged my position, that this was a shelter I'd simply never reached, that my guide was incomplete. I told myself a lot of things while I peeled off my wet gear, grateful past caring. The warmth was real. The dry was real. I ate, lay down, and despite everything began to drift, because exhaustion beats fear most nights. The register woke me back up. I'd reached for it half asleep, the way hikers do, to read who'd been here. The entries were all in old hands, old spelling, old dates, the paper soft and yellowed. The most recent was decades gone, and every single entry, dozens of them across the years, said a version of the same thing. Glad of the shelter, strange place. Did not sleep well, left at first light. Over and over, different hands, different years, left at first light, left before dawn. Not one described a second night. Not one described a departure in daylight. Everyone who wrote in that book left before the sun came up, and every one of them, in their own words, had felt they needed to. And then I understood the warmth had a source, after all. Because from the dark of the sleeping platform behind me, the part I hadn't checked, the part I'd assumed was empty, came the slow, even, unmistakable sound of someone breathing. Asleep, or pretending to be. The breathing of the occupant whose warmth had filled the room before I ever arrived. I did what every name in that book had done. I left at first light, except I didn't wait for light. I packed in the dark, by feel, as quietly as I have ever done anything, while the breathing behind me went on slow and even and patient. I stepped out into the tail of the storm and I walked. I did not look at the platform. I didn't even sign the register, though some impulse nearly made me. I just left the way they all left, before dawn, glad of the shelter and unwilling to meet it. By daylight, miles on, I tried to find it on my maps and my guide. I couldn't. I asked later carefully, the way you learn to ask these things. An old maintainer told me there'd been a shelter on that stretch once, the original generations back, that had burned or fallen. Accounts differed, and that the trail had been rerouted away from the spot for reasons the records were vague about. He said it wasn't on the maps anymore on purpose. I asked if it was safe. He thought a long while, then said the people who used it always seemed to get through the night fine. He said the only rule was the one the register had already taught me without trying. You stay if you have to, but you leave at first light, and you don't ask who keeps it warm. The echo that answered wrong. An echo repeats you. That's the whole of it. Your sound goes out, hits stone, comes back unchanged. It's one of the most reliable phenomena in nature. So when I called out across a gorge just for the animal comfort of hearing my own voice, and the voice that came back said something I had not said in my own exact voice, I learned there's a kind of fear that arrives not as a chill, but as a falling. The floor of the known world is just dropping away. I was on a high overlook above a deep gorge, the kind of place that throws a clean echo. And I was alone and a little lonely in the way long solo hikes make you. I did the thing people do. I cupped my hands and called out across the gap just to hear myself, just to put a human sound into all that empty air. I called my own name, actually, a silly thing, a way of telling a place that didn't care. I'm here. The echo came back, a beat late, off the far wall in my own voice, but it didn't say my name. It said, I'm here too, in my voice. The exact timbre, the exact pitch, the way your own recorded voice sounds wrong to you but stays unmistakable. The timing was an echo's timing. The delay was right, the direction was right, the sound rolled off the far wall the way sound does. Everything about it was a perfect echo except the words, which weren't my words, which were an answer. I stood with my hands still half cupped, and then, because I'm the kind of person who tests things even when testing them is the worst possible idea, I called out again, clearly. Who's there? The echo came back, my voice. The right delay. You know who? Here's why this can't be what it was. An echo reflects a sound that already exists. It can't carry words you didn't speak any more than a mirror can show a face you don't have. For the gorge to answer me in my own voice with words I'd never said, something would have had to capture my voice, its precise character, and use it in the moment to reply. No acoustic phenomenon does that. No atmospheric trick, no rock formation, no folding of sound turns who's there into you know who. Sound does not gain meaning by bouncing. I did not call a third time. Some animal wisdom finally overrode the testing part of me. I shut my mouth, backed away from the edge, and the gorge fell silent, properly silent. No echo even of my own footsteps, as if it had spent all the sound it meant to make. I walked away fast. Behind me, once, faint, I thought I heard my own voice say something else, small, almost tender, but I'd already decided not to hear it, and I kept that decision. The rational frame is that I was tired and alone, and my mind populated the silence that I called out, heard a normal echo, and my lonely brain dressed it in words. Auditory pareidolia. The mind makes speech out of noise the way it makes faces out of shadow. That's real, and I know it's real, and I've leaned on it hard over the years. But pareidolia is vague. It gives you almost words, maybe voices, things you strain to hear. It does not hand you 3 clean, grammatical conversational replies in your own precise voice. each one answering the specific thing you just said. It does not hold up a coherent other side of a conversation. I've never called out across an empty place again, not once, in all the years and all the gorges since. The silence of a place that could throw a perfect echo and chooses not to is the loudest silence I know. And the part I carry, the part I turn over on bad nights, is the second answer, the one I asked for. Who's there? You know who. The terrible thing is, I think I do. I just won't say it out loud. In case it's listening. In case it answers back in my voice that yes, I've got it right. The last entry I ever wrote. I've spent this whole telling on other people's encounters, and the ones I witnessed but walked away from clean. This last one is mine alone, the reason I stopped sleeping in the backcountry, and the reason I write any of this down at all. Because the final register entry I ever left on that trail was answered in the same book, below my own name, while I slept 10 feet away. And the answer used a detail only I could have known, a detail I had never written down anywhere. I'll close with my own because it's only fair and because it's the one that ended my time out there. It came late in my life on the trail, a season when I was already tired in a way that doesn't come back. I stopped at a shelter I'd used 100 times, a friendly, ordinary place. Nothing strange about it, the kind of shelter that feels like an old coworker. I signed the register the way I always did. By then, my entries had shrunk to almost nothing. Trail name, date, a line about the weather, an old habit. But that night, for no reason I can name, I added something I never added. Under my name, almost without deciding to, I wrote a single private line. Tired tonight, thinking about my brother. My brother had died young, long before, and I almost never spoke of him and never, ever wrote about him. It was the most personal thing I'd put in a trail register in 30 years, and I put it there alone, in an empty shelter by headlamp. Then I lay down on the platform, 10 feet from the book, and slept. In the morning there was a new line under mine. It was a hand I didn't recognize, careful, faintly old-fashioned. The letters formed with effort. The way someone writes when writing itself takes concentration. And it was in pencil. There was no pencil in that shelter, but the one in my own pack. And that pencil was still in my pack, still sharp, unmoved. The line read, "He's not tired anymore. He says to tell you it wasn't your fault." You have to understand the weight of that sentence. The circumstances of my brother's death, the specific thing I'd carried for decades, the specific guilt, it was my fault I had never said aloud to a single living soul. Not my wife, not anyone were nowhere in that register. They were nowhere on earth. It wasn't your fault to answer a question I'd never asked out loud, about a death no one at that shelter could have known, addressed to a grief I'd hidden my entire life. I was alone. I'd been alone all night. The shelter was empty when I arrived and empty when I woke. No one had come in. I'm a light sleeper. I'd have known. I'd built my life on knowing. The mud at the entrance held only my own boots. There was no rational frame for this one, and I've never tried hard to build one, because the truth is, part of me never wanted it explained. Part of me wanted it to be exactly what it felt like. I sat with that register a long time as the light came up. And then I did the only thing that felt right. I wrote back, and just, thank you. I closed the book, packed, and walked out. And I have never spent another night in the backcountry since. Not from fear. I want to be clear about that. Not from fear. I stopped because I had been answered, And I knew I'd never be answered like that again, and I didn't want to wear out the gift by going back and asking for more. Some things you're allowed to receive exactly once. I write these stories down, the mile that wasn't there, the dog that wouldn't pass, the photographs, the cairn, the voices in the hollow, all of them, because they happened to me. Whatever happened means out there, and because the people they touched deserve to be remembered. The trail is full of things our instruments can't measure and our maps refuse to show. But I'll be honest here at the end. I don't write them as warnings. I write them because of the last one, because somewhere out there is a book with my brother's message in it, in a hand I never knew, and as long as I keep telling the stories, I get to keep believing it was real. And it was. It was. I checked the answer in my memory, the way I used to check that roll of film. It hasn't changed. He's not tired anymore. It wasn't your fault. Thank you. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to Park Ranger Narrative. Some places are quiet for a reason.